Welcome to the latest episode of our podcast series for financial advisors. Today's episode is Are You Vulnerable? An advisor's guide to surviving and thriving in a hyper-compliant environment. It's a special industry update with my partner, Louis Diamond. I'm Mindy Diamond, and this is the Diamond Podcast for Financial Advisors. This podcast is designed for advisors like you who are interested in learning more about the evolving wealth management industry through candid dialogue with breakaway advisors, those from the C-suite, and industry thought leaders. It's available on our website, diamond-consultants.com, as well as Apple Podcasts and other major podcast platforms. So be sure to subscribe and share it with your colleagues. At Diamond Consultants, our mission is to help advisors live their best business life. We want every elite advisor to find exactly the right place for their business and their clients to thrive, whether it's at a wirehouse, a regional, boutique, or independent firm. As the industry's leading recruiters and consultants, we've transitioned more than $250 billion in assets under management in the past decade. And each year, 25% of transitioning advisors who manage $1 billion or more are our clients. Curious about where, why, and how advisors like you are moving? Download the latest Advisor Transition Report to learn more, including intel on recruiting deals and our insight and analysis on the latest trends in the wealth management space. You'll find it at diamond-consultants.com/transition report. Or if you'd like to talk, feel free to give us a call at 908-879-1002. It's something no advisor wants to hear. You are vulnerable. Regardless of whether you're a star performer with access to the top or someone who runs a comfortable practice, the reality is you are indeed vulnerable. Certainly, you might be saying, that's just a scare tactic. I have nothing to fear. Yet the reality is that any advisor who works for a big firm is subject to a heavy-handed compliance environment designed to ensure that all advisors operate under a single code of conduct. And while that may work for many, it rarely fits most. Even those who operate with exceptions or others who say, I've been doing that for years, are now finding themselves in a place they don't want to be. That is, sitting squarely in the crosshairs of compliance. So how do you survive in an environment that seems designed to catch you in the act? Barbara Herman from our firm recently wrote an article on the topic, the link to which you can find at our website, along with a companion worksheet. And we've written countless articles on the most fearsome topic of all, termination. Yet the goal of this episode is to identify the traps before they become a bigger issue, like administrative leave or termination. It's likely one of the most important conversations we've had to date, so let's get to it. Louis, thanks so much for joining me on this topic.
Yes, of course. It's a thorny topic and sometimes a stressful one to talk about, but it's important. So I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah, let's jump right in. So let's first define what we mean by when we say vulnerable. Does it mean that you're close to being fired?
Yeah, so certainly it could mean close to being fired. But what we've seen is that all advisors, no matter the size of the business, their compliance history, their demeanor, the relationships with management, are in many ways vulnerable, meaning they're one act or movement away from either being fired, placed on administrative leave, or even just having a closer microscope on them. So it's one of those things where if you plan for the worst and hope for the best and just be really careful and not trip any wires, that you can hopefully avoid the worst. But our feeling is really all advisors at any major firm and really any broker dealer, any firm that has to manage the lowest common denominator has a level of vulnerability attached to their business.
Yeah. So before we move on, you mentioned administrative leave. I think a lot of advisors feel that administrative leave is just that. It's either being put on leave, but don't worry, not that vulnerable, and or even the compliance officer or the branch manager that comes in and gives the proverbial slap on the wrist for an action taken. How worried should that advisor be?
From our experience, when you are placed on administrative leave or might be, that's when all the alarm bells should sound. You should be hiring an attorney right away. And most often, administrative leave, it doesn't end well. It could lead to termination. It could lead to just a long period of being in limbo and not being able to deal with clients. But what happens at a minimum is if you get through the administrative leave, you have a very intense microscope on you. I like to use the analogy of driving down the highway behind or in front of a police officer. Inevitably, if they follow you for more than 10 minutes, there's something they can pull you over for. This is similar, where now you have compliance looking at every keystroke, every action, and perhaps something that would have gone under the radar, wouldn't have been noticed, is now certainly going to be flagged. And the firm has more grounds to pursue termination or to do some action that's going to disadvantage a business.
But what about the proverbial slap on the wrist? I think that's the one that can be the most murky. And I remember years ago, an advisor had taken a client at the client's request to a strip club. It was actually a restaurant that happened to have a strip club attached. And the receipt, the name of the restaurant had some XYZ strip club attached to it, gentleman's club, whatever it may have been. And the branch manager jokingly came in and said, "Hey, Bob, you shouldn't have done that. Not a good thing to do. Compliance is watching." The advisor was smart enough to call me and joked about it and said, "Hey, here's what just happened, but I'm sure I'm fine. It's nothing. What do you think?" So let's talk about that for a second. What do you think?
Yeah, I think with something like that, that's maybe if this was 10 years ago, it would have just been brushed aside. Maybe he would have gotten a reprimand or had to sit through some sort of training, but probably fine. I think now what we're seeing is all firms are in a risk-off environment, compliance environment, where it's much easier to eliminate risk rather than trying to make exceptions and to go to bat for folks. It's also a dynamic, which is unfortunate, that a lot of branch managers, complex managers, market leaders, et cetera, have far less power to influence and block the blocker and tackler for an advisor like they used to. So in our view, if there's any sense of my business isn't well supported here, I did something where compliance asked me questions, I feel like there's a chance this could end poorly. It probably makes sense to be proactive and at least talk to an attorney, understand a plan B, and just plan for the worst, even if it ends up being an exercise that you don't have to act upon.
That's actually a really good point, and I agree with that totally. That's what's really changed in this zero risk, zero tolerance environment, that even when you're doing either something you've always done or something that your branch manager dismisses as no big deal, it's still something to pay attention to. But it's also true, and what's changed the most is that even an advisor with a spotless record, who is an elite advisor, top of the food chain, Barron's list, Forbes list, billions under management, even those advisors are vulnerable. And I want to be clear, we're talking about this topic not to be dramatic. We're talking about this topic not to create work for us where it might not otherwise exist. We're talking about it really as a cautionary tale because increasingly we get calls from scared advisors, the smart ones actually, whose spidey sense gets turned on or who feel the hair rise on the back of their neck that something bad is about to happen or could happen and want to have a plan B. So in a lot of cases today, it is the biggest advisors that are most at risk. Years ago, that advisor who was managing billions, clean compliance record would have gotten away with just about anything. That's definitely not the case anymore. So let me ask you a question, Louis. Let's talk about exceptions for a minute. The wealth management space, particularly for top advisors, runs by exception, meaning an advisor has a need that needs to be handled for their clients. They go to branch management. Branch management either makes something happen or creates an exception for that advisor. It's a common privilege amongst advisors we work with. So is that still the case? And how does that play into this topic?
Many advisors are still lucky enough to receive exceptions, but it's far different than it was. You're right. A number of years ago, if you were a multi-million dollar producer, short of a major sales practice violation or doing something really outside the lines, you were probably wrapped in bubble wrap by management and leadership of the firm. And part of that was letting them operate the way that they saw fit, because it was most important to keep the advisor happy and trusting that the advisor was a good advisor and was doing things that were only going to benefit the business and the firm. We've definitely seen that change. Compliance has, I think, increased their power within the organizations as the mandate has become, we need to cut the tail risk. We don't want any sort of regulatory issues. And typically compliance rules that firms make, most of them were created out of, I guess, from a good place. The challenge is how they're applied to everyone, how they're applied equally to a trainee, how they're applied to a multi-million dollar team. And part of that means exceptions go away. The other thing with exceptions is just because you've had an exception over the years, like for example, I have an option strategy that is outside of the firm's typical parameters, but I've operated by exception. It's a strategy that's worked well. The performance is good. It's documented. I have the right professional credentials. Businesses like that, where they're operating on the fringes of what the firm typically allows, there's also the chance that exceptions can go away. And that was what has worked for you for many years before may suddenly change as firms look to standardize businesses, move more towards model portfolios, and really have a more predictable force of advisors. That's really what's happening. Mindy, let me ask you another question. What are some of the warning signs all advisors should pay attention to? I think this is a pretty important question.
Yeah. So, one of them is how many exceptions you operate under. How far out of the norm, out of the management to the lowest common denominator are you operating? And is there a possibility that the guy or the woman that initiated or granted the exception goes away and suddenly that becomes under more of a microscope? But some other warning signs is running a business that no longer fits the core business model or the desired business model of the firm based upon size and nature. So perhaps it's international business or it's managing funds for municipalities, et cetera. Are the clients still a fit? Is there a client type or size that operates under a certain exception? Is there an investment approach you use? Lewis just gave the example of the options approach that is still a fit. And again, the word fit may not be the best word. It's more, does it fall under the sort of management to the lowest common denominator, the unifying principle of the firm, the easiest to manage type of approach? Are there assets managed on a non-discretionary basis? A good one is, are there tensions between you and your team? Is there any possibility that a disgruntled team member causes problems for you? Is there any conflict in the office between you and management in any way? Again, biggest teams often have big egos and oftentimes find themselves in conflict with leadership, but that conflict can ultimately come back to bite you. Are there any changes in firm policy or management that have changed in the recent past that could have informed a different risk appetite on the part of the firm? And I think the biggest warning sign is, have you watched peers, especially peers you respect, go on administrative leave or be terminated?
Yeah, I think just to make this more tangible, you mentioned in part of your answer that there's a change in firm policy or strategy and how that can impact things. What we've seen, not to pick on one firm, but I will, but after UBS acquired Credit Suisse in 2023, we saw that UBS suddenly had to cut some of their risk parameters in order to make the deal happen. And when I mean cut, make the firm more compliant, more uniform. So because of that, we've seen a pretty large uptick in UBS teams, regardless of size, be put more under a microscope or have been given the choice. You have to change what you're doing, change this way of doing business, change the types of clients you're working with, eliminate this one client that's an issue for us, or else face administrative leave or termination. So that's an example of no one was able to predict that UBS was going to buy Credit Suisse, just like no one could predict the global financial crisis. But there's black swan events and things that happen outside of an advisor's control where what's working for them now suddenly cannot be working for them for the long term.
Yeah. And I think the lucky ones are the ones that are given the choice, where management comes in and says, you have a choice of either getting rid of this piece of business or changing what you're doing or risk termination. But there are many that have actually not been given that choice and or missed the warning signs. So why don't we share a couple of examples of folks that have done so? So let me go back to that example of the advisor that took a client to a strip club, a restaurant/strip club. This was probably, I'm going to say 9 years ago or so. So 9 years ago, even in a much less hypervigilant compliance culture, that advisor at first absolutely laughed about the fact that he had been given a slap on the wrist. He said, it's fine. I said to him, I don't think it's fine. Even 9 years ago, I feel a little worried on your behalf. He said, what would you do if you were me? Well, I would make sure that I've got a plan B shored up. Do you know where you would go and that you could go should the worst happen? And at first it, yes, it's been a couple of years since I've done any exploration, but it's really fine. He called me back a week later, and to his credit, said, I've been having trouble sleeping at night. I feel a little worried, and maybe I should pay attention. Let's do a little exploration, at least an armchair exploration as we talk about it. So we did just that. We talked about options that could work. We wound up making a couple of introductions to firm. Sure enough, about 3 weeks after the incident, so now 2 weeks into this advisor shoring up his plan B, which happened pretty quickly, his manager came back and said, we are going to have to put you on administrative leave. And what we did was wound up just accelerating things. He wound up really accelerating the process with the firm where he wound up landing. He got a great deal, no harm, no foul, and all was well. But it was a huge cautionary tale for him and anybody else I've had the opportunity to share that story with.
Yeah. And I've had a few just in recent memory where I don't want to give too much information to protect these individuals' privacy, but it was a family team, and the son on the team, he made a trading error that was flagged by compliance, and mistakes happen. But he started to get a lot more questions from compliance, and he realized that there were things that management and compliance were bringing up that were a year or two before. So this advisor unfortunately missed the warning signs. He should have known that if the firm was digging this deep into the past, that he had a target on his back. Unfortunately, he missed the warning sign and was terminated. He was still able to find gainful employment, but he was on the sidelines for over 30 days while his U-5 was filed. And he definitely landed at a firm that wouldn't have been top of his list if this didn't happen otherwise. Another example is with the SEC's crackdown on business texting. There's been a massive wave of terminations, not just at the wirehouses, at independent firms and the like, who all have a massive microscope on their practices. And we've seen 2 or 3 just recent examples of advisors who were caught texting not through their approved cell phone or messaging app. And those folks were unfortunately terminated. So there's certain events that are one-offs, but there's more that are, we'll say, cyclical kind of key themes. So we've seen a number of terminations with business texting. We've seen a lot of terminations around retiring advisor agreements and advisors changing pool splits in order to circumvent the policy. There's just key things that are happening now where if you think you've done this, you may do this, et cetera. Just know that these are the specific actions that firms are looking for. That the same thing goes in this environment for anything around either sexual harassment or anything HR related when it comes to team members or folks in the office. That has become an immediate termination where years ago it may have been laughed off. It's just, that's just him. He's just being funny. But now if there is any sort of HR complaint or even a potential for a complaint, that's been an immediate termination and another potential missed warning sign for many folks that reach out to us, oftentimes either when it's too late or when the wheels are already in motion and it's much harder to formulate a really attractive plan B for them.
Yeah. And to ensure that the plan B can be to the best possible firm, not have to land at a sub-tier firm. So the idea is to head all of this off before it becomes a termination. So let's switch gears a little bit and give our listeners some proactive things that they can pay attention to and do. So, aside from the warning signs we talked about, Lewis, what are some impending signs that shouldn't be ignored?
Management, legal teams, compliance are asking questions. Of course, it's natural that you may have the normal compliance alerts and whatnot, but I'd say, look at the patterns. Is this different than it's been in the past? Are they digging deeper into the past than they have before? Is the level of detail that they're asking for different? That's certainly a warning sign. Another one is certainly around a client complaint, whether there was a complaint filed or something has been surfaced. While one of the benefits of working for a big firm is they have deep pockets, they're on the same side of the table as you for the most part, as far as defending against a client complaint. What we've seen is oftentimes the firms throw the advisor under the bus. And I've seen it 2 times recently where it was an advisor with a spotless compliance record before. They had a client who was disgruntled about either a risky investment that was properly disclosed that went to zero or didn't work out, or they deem there to be a trading error or the like. And it becomes hell for the advisor. So I'd say if you have a pending file client complaint or the like, you can't just accept that the firm is definitively going to have your back. It's going to go away. That's the perfect time to hire an attorney, make sure you have someone representing your interests exclusively, and not necessarily take the firm's word for it. Most folks who get a client complaint are going to be completely fine. It happens. But we're seeing it more and more where the smallest of client issues can either lead to the firm looking deeper into things and finding something that was missed before, or looking to cut the risk and wanting to send a signal that we're not going to tolerate this type of behavior or whatever it is. And unfortunately, the advisor is the casualty in all of it. And then the last one, which is probably the most important tool any advisor has in their arsenal, is trusting your gut. Advisors, they know what it's like to work at their firm. They know what a day in the life is. Things just feel different. The energy you're receiving from your manager, you're starting to get more compliance alerts. You're starting to just see things change. You saw a friend of yours get terminated. Someone on your team is having issues. You got to trust your gut and ultimately be proactive rather than just sweeping it under the rug if you feel like there might be even the smallest chance that you're vulnerable or there's something else that's going on.
Yeah. So I think the hope for the best approach is probably not good enough today. And again, as Lewis said, most people will wind up being perfectly fine in any one of these circumstances. But the idea of being an employee is essentially not having control or agency or entire control or agency over your professional life. What we're talking about here is giving you the best shot at retaining as much agency as you possibly can to have options and the best possible path forward under your control.
And what I'll add too is it's not even being an employee. We see almost as many terminations from independent broker dealers, from RIAs. Every firm is under a different compliance obligation than they were before. And as long as you're on any sort of platform, there's always going to be a level of lowest common denominator. So while the Advisor Hub headlines and a lot of the high profile stories surround very significant wirehouse teams being terminated, I think all of these lessons are very true for independent advisors as well, because they're just as likely to trip a wire on the compliance side as someone who's employed by a bank or a wirehouse. There's just sometimes things that an independent advisor can do differently. They're allowed to have outside business activities. They're allowed to charge financial planning fees. They're sometimes allowed to advise on assets off platform. So there's a narrower scope of reasons why an independent advisor might get terminated, but certainly anything around sales practice, business texting, sexual harassment, HR type issues, et cetera, those are all very front and center for every firm across the industry.
Interesting. And that is absolutely a change in the last decade for sure. It used to be that once you went independent, no matter what version of independence, you were safe. But let's talk a little bit about the proactive, specific recommended proactive actions that an advisor can take if they're feeling particularly vulnerable. So you mentioned hire an expert securities attorney, and I would say that's a smart one. Anytime your gut tells you that there is the slightest whisper of a possibility of trouble brewing, you should reach out to your attorney. This is not meant to be an advertisement for an attorney, but it is to say that, especially in this hypervigilant environment, that most advisors should have a securities attorney that they trust, at least on speed dial or in their contacts, so they know who they would contact to get guidance, because a securities attorney will be able to tell you whether you're being crazy and overreacting or whether there's something really to be concerned about and something that you should do about it. The second thing is be far more careful than normal and ensure that every action you take is beyond reproach. So what we're saying is be the ideal corporate citizen. Make sure that you're dotting every I and crossing every T, so you are not giving anyone the opportunity or the chance to catch you doing something wrong.
Yeah. So I think the next point is don't do anything differently. If you never used to print documents from your office, don't all of a sudden start doing it and start printing client review files. If you didn't already manage money in a certain way, don't start doing it now. If you weren't out of the office 4 days a week before, don't start doing it now. Basically, you want to just keep a similar pattern so that you're not flagging anything or doing anything rash. A lot of times advisors, especially if they think they're going to leave or they feel like their hand's going to be forced to leave, they'll try to get a leg up, which is understandable. But know that especially if you have a magnifying glass on you, every action is likely going to be found. Every keystroke is going to be monitored. Every document saved, document sent is going to be looked at. Files in your office could potentially be looked at if you leave. So don't do anything that gives the firm an ability to have proof that you violated terms of your employment agreement or give them grounds to accelerate a potential administrative leave or termination.
Yeah. And pursuant to that is assume the worst and operate as if you're likely to be terminated. And again, you hope for the best, but you operate as if there's a possibility otherwise. And so developing a smart and thorough and strategic plan B and acting upon it, meaning making sure that you are far enough along in process with whatever firm or model or models or firms would be your plan B, so that if tomorrow you got terminated, it would be easy enough to pick up the phone and hope that something could happen, that a transaction or a transition could be enacted. Now, that's the key. What you want to be able to do is to prevent or usurp termination. So what we're looking for is, as the handwriting on the wall becomes clearer, as you see the warning signs and you think termination is a possibility, we are suggesting that you act before you are actually terminated, because it will exponentially multiply the number of potential quality options you can consider beyond that. Not in any way saying that as an advertisement for transition, not at all. But it is to say that working with a recruiter who has a lot of experience in this field and with situations like this is really smart.
Yeah. So again, not meant as a self-serving statement at all. But the fact is, firms like ours and many of our competitors, we see advisor terminations, administrative leaves, and just these topics that we're talking about in real life action multiple times a month. So we have many reps at doing this. We know what typically happens. And most importantly, we know with a pretty high degree of certainty which firms or types of firms are actually going to be realistic. Most advisors are going to prefer to land at their number one option, right? I have a relationship with so-and-so over the years, but working with the firm like ours, we can be really realistic and say, you know what, we've seen this before with other advisors. While they like you and there's a 5% chance they might hire you, we should really be spreading out what we're looking at to include, we'll say, some safety schools, maybe some firms that are a notch below what you normally would have thought of. Maybe you look at some independent options that might be a little bit more lenient with hiring you, because ultimately the goal is to land at the best possible firm in the quickest period of time. The other thing that we serve as with our advisor clients in the situation is we're very much a life coach or a psychologist. It's someone to talk to. It's a very isolating time potentially. So because we have this experience in working with folks in a similar situation, we know the landmines, we know the questions to ask, we know the likely firms, and we can help orient you around, even if it's not the information you want to hear, what could potentially happen. So I think similar to hiring an attorney, hiring a consultant or a recruiter I'm biased. I think it's always valuable and impactful. But in a situation like this, where you have to mobilize action really quickly, we can become like your Navy SEALs and get meetings set up as soon as possible at the right types of firms and ultimately look to get you hired as quickly as possible and also with the best possible financial circumstances.
Yeah. You mentioned to me a best practice that you've advised advisors in this situation, meaning an advisor that begins to have a gut sense that something could be amiss, worried either about termination or got a warning sign that makes them nervous. What's that best practice you mentioned to me? Because I thought it was incredibly smart.
Yeah, so this goes in the category of being careful and not doing anything rash. But I think it's always good practice, even if you're not feeling vulnerable, every month or so, take a picture on your phone of your firm's official production statement. This gives you a way to document your business, because what happens is if you're on administrative leave, certainly for terminated, you're frozen out of your firm's systems and aren't able to get your production statement, which ultimately gives another firm or platform the ability to underwrite your business for a recruiting deal. And aside from just taking your word on, oh, I'm doing $2 million and I have 300 million in assets, it gives them confidence that what you're saying is true. Not that they don't trust you, but at the end of the day, big dollars are at stake. And ultimately what we're asking is a firm, in many cases, to take a chance on an advisor because they like them, they don't think they did anything wrong, or they don't think that the issue that happened is going to be so my advice would be every month or so, no matter what, take a picture on your iPhone, on your Android, whatever, of your production statement, because that becomes an invaluable life raft where we can potentially get a recruiting deal based upon what the business was doing, rather than a deal being fully back-ended because a firm isn't able to get comfortable in what the business looks like.
Yeah. Now, here's a caveat. Taking a picture of your production statement is not the same as taking a picture of all of your client accounts. What you need to be mindful of is not in any way violating your post-employment restrictions or violating protocol. So taking a picture of production statement, that is something you own, or that is your record of productivity with your firm. Taking a picture of your client statements could be in direct violation of protocol, and that's something you want to do under the direction of an attorney. Okay, let's pivot. So aside from the obvious, why is being terminated a big deal?
Yeah, it's a big deal. Obviously, your Form U5, your FINRA broker check will be marked up. It's like a permanent record of your career. Of course, that's a big deal. But most firms have either developed a blanket policy for not hiring advisors who have been terminated because they've been in the crosshairs of regulators or they don't want to find themselves there, or at a minimum, it drastically slows down the process for being hired. So the typical cadence, I'll take a second to explain how it works. Let's say an advisor is terminated. Their prior employer or broker-dealer has up to 30 days to file the U5 language, which is the official language of what happened. You can bet that the firm is going to take 29 days, 23 hours, and 17 minutes to file that language. It's to their advantage to keep the advisor on the sideline for as long as possible, because one, it gives them time to get their ducks in a row, but more importantly, it gives them time to redistribute accounts and not allow the advisor to be working with clients and generating revenue. So number one, it just slows things down. If you've been on administrative leave, that's a time period where you can't be with clients. Plus you take into account this 30 days at a minimum before you can get hired. It's a big deal as far as client retention. Also, just being terminated, it absolutely eliminates many top tier firms. It puts you either under heightened supervision when you join a firm. And I think just most importantly, you're probably going to have to settle for a firm or platform or even a business model that you may not have thought of before. So termination, it's stressful for everyone. I think the positive thing is many people have gone through this before. There's really good attorneys that can provide really good advice and try to mitigate U5 language before it's filed. Working with firms like ours, we can get you in front of the right firms in the quickest period of time. And ultimately, the goal is to find some place where you can have your licenses transfer, you can start getting paid again, you can start serving clients. And even if that firm becomes a halfway house, you're there for a year or 2 or 5 years to rehabilitate your image, recorral your clients, and then you would be looked at in a different way to other potential firms.
Yeah, and I think let's make sure that we end this on a positive note. The goal here is to avoid termination. And the whole reason we decided to do this episode is to give you the tips and sort of the lens into what it takes to make sure that you prevent it. And I think now you have a better understanding of why termination, that T word, is as bad a word as there is and what we're all trying to avoid. Generally speaking, I want to sort of wrap this up by saying that proactivity should be the watchword for any advisor. Forget about whether you're worried about being vulnerable, you're worried about termination, forget about anything going on. Advisors should always make sure that they are in a place where they feel they have the most amount of agency over their professional life, that they understand what their options are elsewhere. It doesn't mean you're going to use them or you're going to move, but that you have a sense of where you are in space and you understand what your options could be if you need them, and that you are in a place where you could really live with any and all actions or changes or modifications that your firm makes so that you're best positioned in that tennis stance, ready to pivot at any given moment. That's the best way to ensure you've got agency over your professional life. With that, Louis, any closing tips you'd like to add? Anything you want to wrap up with?
I think that about covers it. I'm glad we ended on a positive note, because again, this wasn't meant to be sounding the alarm bells and worrying everyone. But I think a healthy dose of paranoia and worry is helpful sometimes in driving proactivity, which is what we're talking about. So after you've listened to this episode, be sure to visit the episode page, because we've created a companion worksheet or a tool that has many tips and tricks for how to spot signs of vulnerability, what to do if you've been terminated, and probably just helpful to understand all these different things in a little bit more detail. And we'll also link to this article that Mindy referenced that goes into even a little bit more detail on what we're talking about. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you. And thank you for listening. Curious about where, why, and how advisors like you are moving? Download the latest Advisor Transition Report to learn more, including intel on recruiting deals and our insight and analysis on the latest trends in the wealth management space. You'll find it at diamond-consultants.com/transition report. Or if you'd like to talk, feel free to give us a call at 908-879-1002.